Once upon a time, a little girl said, "My mom didn't come home last night." The CEO followed her and discovered something shocking that changed their lives forever. An emotional story that will touch your heart. Subscribe, give a thumbs up, and comment where you are watching from. The light drizzle of June transformed the streets of New York City into a grey mirror, reflecting the lights of skyscrapers that vanished into the mist. Edward Carter adjusted the collar of his English wool overcoat as he descended the stairs of the Empire State Building, where he had just wrapped up yet another meeting that would secure millions in contracts for his pharmaceutical company. At 52, he had built an empire that rivaled foreign multinationals, turning Carter Pharmaceuticals into the largest domestic industry in the sector. The biting cold of 15 degrees Celsius contrasted with the warmth still emanating from the heated discussion he had with Japanese investors. Edward was known for his relentless determination. He never accepted a no as a final answer, and his ability to turn obstacles into opportunities had made him a legend in the corporate world. His grey hair, always impeccably styled, and his tailored Italian suits were his trademarks, as was the gold Rolex that never left his wrist. "Sir, the driver is waiting in the garage," informed Marcus, his personal assistant, following him a few steps behind. Edward nodded, checking emails on his phone as he walked. This was how his life operated, every minute timed, every movement calculated to maximize results. There was no room for surprises in his meticulously organized schedule. Then she appeared. A little girl of about 6 emerged from the crowd of hurried pedestrians, as if materializing from the drizzle itself. Her brown hair was wet and stuck to her face, and she wore a faded pink jacket over patched jeans. Despite the simplicity of her clothes, everything was clean and well kept, revealing the care of someone who made it a point to maintain dignity even amidst difficulties. "Sir?" Her small, trembling voice cut through the noise of traffic. "Please, sir." Edward stopped abruptly, causing a small commotion among the executives following him. The girl had firmly grasped the sleeve of his overcoat with her tiny, cold hands. When he looked down, he found a pair of brown eyes filled with tears, yet shining with a surprising determination for someone so young. "My mom didn't come home last night," she said, her words coming out in between sobs she tried to control. "Aunt Mary said she always lets us know when she's going to be late, but this time she didn't. She works cleaning big buildings like this one, sir. Can you help me find her?" Marcus stepped closer, ready to discreetly usher the child away with the efficiency that characterized his work. But Edward raised his hand, signaling him to stop. Something in that desperate look had penetrated his carefully constructed defenses over decades. "What's your a name, little one?" Edward asked, crouching down to be at her eye level, not caring about the suit getting wet on the damp ground. "Isabella. Isabella Carter," she replied, wiping her nose with the sleeve of her jacket. "My mum's name is Sarah. She's very pretty and always smells like sweet soap. Do you know my mum?" Edward felt a tightness in his chest that he couldn't explain. There was something in the way the girl spoke, in how she held his hand with unwavering trust, that awakened long-buried memories. He remembered himself at 7, lost in the streets of a poor neighborhood in East Harlem, searching for the father who never returned from work at the factory. "Where do you live, Isabella?" he asked, surprised by the kindness that naturally emerged in his voice. "In East Harlem, sir. It's kind of far from here, but Aunt Mary gave me money for the bus. She said maybe the important men in the city could help find my mom." Edward looked around. Passers-by hurried by, some casting curious glances at the unusual scene of the most feared businessman in New York, crouched in the rain, talking to a child from the outskirts. Marcus cleared his throat discreetly, reminding him of the tight schedule. "Mr. Carter, the board meeting is scheduled for 4 o'clock, murmured the assistant. But Edward wasn't listening. His eyes remained fixed on the girl's face, where he recognized a vulnerability that mirrored his own childhood of abandonment and disappointments. Sarah Carter. The name echoed in his mind, but he couldn't place it among his memories. "Isabella, can you take me to your home?" he heard himself asking, the words coming out before his rational mind could censor them. The girl nodded vigorously, a shy smile lighting up her face for the first time. "Are you really going to help me?" "I will," Edward replied, standing up and extending his hand to her. "Marcus, cancel the board meeting. Tell them an urgent matter has come up." "But sir, it's the export contracts for Mexico." "The Mexicans can wait," Edward said with a firmness that allowed no questioning. "Some things are more important than money." Marcus blinked, incredulous. In 15 years working for Edward Carter, he had never heard him utter those words. As they walked toward the bus stop, Isabella chattered about her routine, about the public school she attended in the morning, and how she helped Aunt Mary take care of the garden in the small space between the shacks. Edward found himself genuinely interested in every detail of the girl's simple life, a world as distant from his as Earth was from the moon. "My mum always says that honest work dignifies a person," Isabella commented, swinging her legs as they waited for the bus. "She cleans buildings at night so she can pick me up from school during the day. She's very smart, you know. She reads the newspaper every day and always explains the news to me." The bus arrived packed, typical of New York City public transport in the late afternoon. Edward had never stepped into a bus before. Isabella boarded the municipal bus without hesitation. The smell of sweat mixed with cheap perfumes, the noise of strained engines and overlapping conversations created a completely new urban symphony for her ears, accustomed to the silence of the armored Mercedes. During the nearly 2-hour journey to East Harlem, Edward observed New York City from a perspective he had never known. He saw women returning from domestic work still in their uniforms, men with calloused hands, dozing against the window, and students with patched backpacks doing homework as the bus moved. "That's where my mum worked last week," Isabella pointed to a commercial building. "She said she cleaned 30 floors by herself. She came home with her hands all bruised, but she never complained. My mum never complains." Edward felt a lump in his throat. His buildings were also cleaned by women like Sarah, but he had never thought about their lives, their children, their dreams. To him, they were just numbers on the operational cost spreadsheet. When they finally got off the bus, it was already dark. East Harlem stretched out before them like a maze of dim lights and narrow streets. Edward followed Isabella through the dirt alleys, passing by bars with loud music, children playing in the street despite the cold, and women chatting at their doorsteps. "It's right there," said Isabella, pointing to a small wooden shack with a floral curtain in the window. "Aunt Mary!" A black woman in her 60s appeared at the door, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes widened at the sight of Isabella, accompanied by a man in an expensive suit. "Isa, my girl, where have you been? And who is this gentleman?" "Aunt Mary, this is the man who's going to help us find my mum. He's very important. He works in those big buildings downtown." Edward extended his hand to Mary, who shook it cautiously. "Edward Carter, Mum. Isabella asked me for help in finding her mother. May I come in? I'd like to understand the situation better." Mary hesitated for a moment, but Edward's sincere gaze and Isabella's hopeful smile convinced her. "Come in, please. I apologize for the simplicity of the house." The interior of the shack was small, but impeccably organized. A curtain divided the single space into 2 areas, the living room with a 2-seater sofa and a small television, and the bedroom where Isabella slept with her mother. Family photographs adorned the walls, and the smell of fresh coffee lingered in the air. "Please have a seat," offered Mary, gesturing to the sofa. "Would you like some coffee? I just made it." While Mary prepared the coffee, Edward observed the photographs. One caught his attention. A young brunette with green eyes smiled at the camera, holding a baby Isabella in her arms. There was something familiar about that face, something that made his heart race. "Is this Sarah?" he asked, pointing to the photo. "Yes," Mary replied, returning with a steaming cup. "My best friend. I've known her for a long time, since Isa was little. Sarah is a hard worker. She never caused trouble for anyone. That's why I'm so worried. She would never leave without telling anyone, especially leaving Isa behind." Edward took the cup with hands that were beginning to tremble slightly. That face. Where had he seen it before? Night had completely fallen over East Harlem, and a new chapter in Edward. Carter's life was just beginning. Mary's coffee was strong and bitter, just as he remembered his grandmother used to make during his humble childhood in Springfield. As he sipped the hot drink, he discreetly observed every detail of the environment that contrasted sharply with the corporate palaces where he spent his days. "Aunt Mary," Edward began, placing the cup on the chipped saucer, "could you tell me exactly what happened? When was the last time you saw Sarah?" Mary sighed deeply, adjusting her apron as she sat in a plastic chair next to the sofa. Isabella had settled on the floor, playing with a rag doll, but Edward noticed her ears were perked up, listening to the conversation. "It was the morning before yesterday, around 7 o'clock, Mary reported, the wrinkles on her face deepening with worry. "Sarah always has coffee here with me before she goes to pick up Isa from school. She said she was going to work the night shift at a new company downtown. She mentioned it was a very important building, full of fancy offices." Edward leaned forward, sensing that this information would be crucial. "Did she mention the name of the company? Or the address of the building?" "Not really," Mary replied, scratching her head. "She just said it was one of those big pharmaceutical companies. She said they paid better than other places, but she had to sign some confidentiality papers. I thought it was strange because Sarah never had to sign anything to clean an office." Edward's blood ran cold. Pharmaceutical companies downtown, confidentiality contracts for cleaners. His business mind immediately began to connect dots he would have preferred to keep separate. "Uncle Edward," Isabella's voice interrupted his thoughts. The girl had come closer and was looking at him with her big, trusting eyes. "Why do you look worried? My mom is okay, right?" Edward forced a reassuring smile, gently touching the girl's head. "I'm just thinking about the best places to look for her, little one. Your mom is very smart. I'm sure she's okay." But inside, a storm of worries was beginning to form. His own company used outsourced cleaning services, just like all the other pharmaceutical companies downtown. And recently, there had been rumors in the industry about information leaks, industrial espionage, and confidential investigations. "Aunt Mary," Edward said, trying to keep his tone casual, "you mentioned that Sarah read the newspaper every day. Did she talk about her work, about the companies she worked for?" Mary thought for a few seconds. "Now that you mention it, in the past few weeks she had been acting a bit strange. She was asking odd questions about medications, prices of medication, those things. I thought it was just curiosity because Isabella caught a cold and the medicine was too expensive." "What kind of questions?" insisted Edward, feeling his heart race. "She asked if I thought it was normal for cold medicine to cost more than $50, if it was fair, and for a company to make so much money selling things that the poor need to survive," explained Mary. "She said she saw a lot of things in the offices, papers thrown in the trash, conversations she overheard unintentionally." Edward swallowed hard. He knew exactly what kind of sensitive information circulated in the pharmaceutical industry offices: profit margin reports, pricing strategies, agreements with distributors. Information that, in the wrong hands, could cause monumental scandals. "My mum is very smart," said Isabella proudly, still sitting on the floor. "She always says that knowledge is power, and that the poor need to be informed so they aren't deceived. That's why she reads so many newspapers. And what newspapers does she read, Isabella? Asked Edward, trying to sound uninterested. The ones that talk about politics and economics. She cuts out articles and keeps them in a folder. She said she's studying to understand how the world works, the girl replied. Mary nodded. It's true. Sarah has always been studious, even though she only finished high school. She dreamed of going to college for journalism, but then she got pregnant with Isabella and had to work. Edward felt a tightness in his chest. Journalism. An intelligent, observant woman with access to privileged information, working for pharmaceutical companies. The puzzle began to form in his mind, and the image emerging was anything but reassuring. "Can I see that folder of clippings?" Edward asked. Mary and Isabella exchanged glances. "It's at home," said Isabella. "Can I go get it?" "No, little one. It's already dark and dangerous. Tomorrow we'll go there together," Edward decided. "For today, I think it's better for you two to stay here." Edward stayed at Mary's house until almost midnight, listening to stories about Sarah and Isabella, getting to know the simple yet dignified routine of that small family. He discovered that Sarah had been working as a cleaner for 7 years, always on the night shifts so she could take care of Isabella during the day. She dreamed of giving her daughter a better life, saving every penny to pay for a technical course that would qualify her for a better job. She always said that Isabella would be the first in the family to go to university, Mary said with teary eyes. She bought used books at the thrift store, taught the girl math and English. She said education was the only inheritance she could leave. Edward watched Isabella sleeping on the sofa, covered with a colourful crocheted blanket that Mary had made. The girl had fallen asleep, listening to the adults' conversations, holding tightly to her cloth doll. There was a peace on her face that contrasted with the storm of worries Edward felt growing in his chest. When he finally left Mary's house, Edward experienced a strange sensation. The cold air of the New York City night hit him differently. He was no longer the powerful CEO returning home after a day of corporate achievements. He was a man deeply troubled by having glimpsed a world that had always existed in the shadows of his reality. The taxi he called took almost an hour to arrive in East Harlem. The driver, a middle-aged man with a southern accent, talked the entire way about the difficulties of life in the neighborhood. "You're not from around here, are you?" the taxi driver observed, glancing at Edward's rumpled suit in the rearview mirror. "What brings a fine man like you to these parts?" "I came to help a family," Edward replied simply. "Ah, I see. You're one of those businessmen who do charity," the driver said with a tone that couldn't hide a hint of sarcasm. "I've met several like that. They show up once a year, give out some food baskets, take a picture for the newspaper, and go back to their mansions." Edward felt a pang of irritation, but then reflected on the man's words. How many times had he himself participated in charity events that served more to cleanse his conscience and improve his corporate image than to actually help someone? "It's not quite like that," Edward murmured. "It's, complicated." "Sorry, boss. I didn't mean to offend." The taxi driver said, "It's just that we see so much. There are good people too, of course, but the poor around here, they kind of distrust when someone very different shows up, you know?" For the rest of the ride to his mansion in the Upper East Side, Edward remained silent, processing everything he had experienced that day. Upon arriving home, the brutal difference between the two worlds hit him like a punch to the stomach. His home, a 3-story mansion with a landscaped garden and heated pool, was silent and cold. The housekeeper had left dinner ready in the fridge, grilled salmon with asparagus that cost more than Mary spent on food for an entire week. Edward went up to the office on the 2nd floor, a mahogany and leather environment with a panoramic view of the city. He turned on the computer and began researching all the pharmaceutical companies that had offices in the area where Isabella had found him. The list was extensive. Besides his own company, there were at least 12 other corporations in the area, including some direct competitors. Did any of them have the capability to harm a simple cleaner who might have seen or heard something compromising? As he sipped a 20-year-old scotch, Edward looked out the panoramic window at the lights of New York City. Somewhere in that sea of light, Sarah Santos was missing, and her little daughter slept without understanding why her mother hadn't come home. For the first time in decades, Edward Carter felt that there was something more important than his quarterly profits, and that realization scared him more than any financial crisis he had ever faced. It was 3 in the morning when he finally shut down the computer, knowing that the next day his life would never be the same. The alarm clock rang at 6 in the morning, but Edward had been awake for hours. He had spent the night tossing and turning in bed, unable to shake the image of Isabella's confident eyes and Mary's worried words from his mind. For the first time in 20 years, he cancelled his morning run in Central Park and called Marcus before 7. "Marcus, I need you to do some discreet research for me," Edward said, still in his pajamas, looking out the bedroom window at the dew-covered garden. "I want to know which cleaning companies provide services for pharmaceutical companies in the Augusta and Paulista area." "Sure, sir. May I ask why?" Marcus inquired, clearly surprised by the unusual request. "Let's just say it's a personal matter," Edward replied. "And Marcus, I want that information today. Cancel my morning meetings." After his shower, Edward dressed casually, something his employees had never seen him do. Dark jeans, a navy blue cotton shirt, and a black blazer. Looking at himself in the mirror, he felt strangely exposed, as if the corporate armor he had worn for decades was part of his skin. By 9 o'clock, he was back in East Harlem. The neighborhood had a completely different rhythm during the day. Uniformed children running to school, women hanging clothes on makeshift lines between houses, men fixing old cars in backyard garages. The sound of street vendors mixed with the noise of crowded buses and the music blaring from speakers at the doors of homes. "Uncle Edward!" Isabella shouted as she saw him arrive. She ran to meet him wearing her municipal school uniform, a white blouse and a blue skirt that, despite being worn, was impeccably clean and pressed. "You really came back. Aunt Mary said you might not return." Edward knelt down to be at the girl's height, feeling a pang of guilt. "I promised I would help you find your mother, didn't I? And I always keep my promises." Mary appeared at the door, wiping her hands on her apron. Her gaze was cautious, but there was a glimmer of hope in her tired eyes. "Good morning, Mr. Edward. I didn't expect you back so soon." "Good morning, Aunt Mary. I thought we could take a look at that scrapbook you mentioned yesterday," Edward said, standing up. "Oh yes, Isabella already sorted everything before she went to school. Come, it's right next door." They walked just a few meters until they reached the small house where Sarah and Isabella lived. It was even smaller than Mary's place. A single room divided by curtains, with a makeshift kitchen in one corner and a tiny bathroom in the back. But just like Mary's house, everything was organized with meticulous care. Isabella ran to a small wooden shelf and grabbed a yellowed folder. "Here are the clippings about my mother," she said, handing the folder to Edward with the solemnity of someone delivering a treasure. Edward opened the folder and felt his stomach churn. Dozens of articles about the pharmaceutical industry were carefully cut out and organized by date. Headlines like "Exorbitant drug prices generate billion-dollar profits," "Pharmaceutical CPI investigates cartel," and "Families go into debt to buy essential medications" jumped off the yellowed pages. "My mother always said that the poor need to be informed," Isabella commented, sitting next to Edward on the single bed she shared with her mother. She said that rich people hold meetings to decide how much the medicines will cost without thinking about the children who get sick and can't get treatment. Edward flipped through the clippings with growing apprehension. There were handwritten notes in the margins, Sarah's neat handwriting making connections between different articles, calculating profit margins, questioning pricing policies. It was the work of someone who was not just reading out of curiosity, but conducting a serious investigation. "Look at this one, Uncle Edward," Isabella said, pointing to an article about cartel investigations. "My mother marked the names of several companies. She said she knew these companies because she worked for them." Edward's blood ran cold when he saw his own company, Carter Pharmaceuticals, circled in red pen, along with notes about night meetings and sensitive documents. "Isabella," Edward said, trying to keep his voice calm, "did your mother say anything specific about these companies, about what she saw when she worked for them?" The girl thought for a moment, swinging her legs that didn't reach the ground. She said the men in suits talked about very large numbers, about how much money they would make if the medicines became more expensive, and that she saw important papers in the trash, papers that talked about secret prices. Edward closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of the revelation. Sarah was not just an ordinary cleaner. She was collecting evidence of potentially illegal practices in the pharmaceutical industry. And if his suspicions were correct, she had become a threat to very powerful people. "Mr. Edward," Mary said, who had been listening to the conversation at the door, "there's one more thing that might be important. Last week, Sarah received a strange phone call." Edward stood up immediately. "What kind of call?" It was a man with a thin, nervous voice. He asked if she was sure she wanted to continue with that work. When Sarah asked who he was, he hung up. "Did she?" "And tell anyone else?" Edward asked, feeling a wave of panic. "Only me and Isabella, because the girl was here when the phone rang," Mary replied. Sarah was a bit scared, but she said she wasn't going to give up. She said she was doing it for the poor children who need medicine and can't afford it. Edward looked at Isabella, who was innocently playing with a rag doll, oblivious. The gravity of the situation weighed heavily on him. If his suspicions were correct, Sarah had disappeared because she discovered something she shouldn't have, and now he was getting entangled in a web of corruption that could not only destroy his career, but also put innocent lives at risk. "Aunt Mary, do you have a phone number for the company where Sarah was working the night she disappeared?" Edward asked. "No, but she wrote down the address on a piece of paper," said Mary, rummaging through a small drawer. "Here it is, Building 1247, Augusta Street." Edward recognized the building. It housed one of his company's main competitors, Biotech Solutions, run by Robert Smith, a man he had known for 15 years and with whom he had closed several market deals. "Mr. Edward," the small voice of Isabella interrupted his dark thoughts, "do you look scared? Is my mom in danger?" Edward crouched down again in front of the girl, holding her little cold hands. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I promise you that I will find out where she is, even if it means dealing with very powerful people." Edward's phone rang at that moment. It was Marcus. "Sir, I got the information you requested," said the assistant. "The company responsible for cleaning most of the pharmaceutical companies in the area is CleanCo Services. But there's something strange. In the last 2 months, 3 employees from that company have disappeared without a trace. They all worked the night shift at pharmaceutical companies." Edward felt the world spin around him. 3 employees? "Yes, sir. And there are rumors that they were asking inconvenient questions about the documents they saw during work." Edward hung up the phone with trembling hands. He looked at Isabella, who was watching him with those trusting eyes, waiting for him to solve everything like a fairy tale hero her mother read to her. But reality was much darker than any fairy tale. Sarah Carter hadn't simply disappeared. She had been silenced for discovering secrets that could shake the entire pharmaceutical industry. And now Edward Carter, one of the leading figures in that very industry, had to decide if he was willing to sacrifice everything he had built to save a woman who might already be too late to rescue. The sound of an ambulance siren echoed in the distance, cutting through the morning air of East Harlem like a portent of the danger approaching. Edward spent the rest of the morning at Sarah's house, examining every detail that could provide clues about her disappearance. In a small drawer of the dresser, he found more material that confirmed his worst fears: cell phone photographs of documents scattered in office trash bins, notes about conversations overheard during the night shift, and even audio recordings on an old digital recorder. "My mom always carried that little recorder in her bag," explained Isabella, holding the small silver device. "She said it was to record songs from the radio, but sometimes I heard her listening to men's voices talking about money." With trembling hands, Edward pressed play. The recorded voice was muffled but perfectly understandable. "If we keep prices high for another 6 months, we will consolidate a 400% margin over production costs. The government folks are distracted with the elections. It's the perfect time to implement the new pricing scheme." Edward recognized the voice immediately. It belonged to Robert Smith, the sales director of Biotech Solutions, and his acquaintance for over a decade. They had dined together the previous month, discussing market strategies that Edward now realized were much more sinister than he had imagined. "There are more recordings here," said Mary, handing over a small box with several USB drives. "Sarah was very careful. She always said that one day this information would help poor people understand why medicines are so expensive." Edward connected one of the USB drives to the laptop he had brought. The files revealed a meticulous investigation conducted by Sarah over several months. She had documented secret meetings between executives from different laboratories, illegal price-fixing agreements, and even bribes paid to health inspectors to expedite drug approvals. "Jesus Christ," Edward murmured, running his hand through his hair. "She discovered everything." "Uncle Edward, what did my mom find out?" asked Isabella, climbing onto the chair next to him to see the laptop screen. Edward quickly closed the file, realizing that the child should not be exposed to such dangerous information. "Your mom is very smart, sweetheart. She discovered some important things about her job." Edward's phone rang again. This time, it was a number he didn't recognize. "Edward Carter?" asked an unfamiliar male voice when he answered. "Yes, who is this?" "Someone who knows where you were last night and this morning. Someone who also knows that you shouldn't be meddling in matters that don't concern you." Edward felt a chill run down his spine. He quickly stood up, moving away from Isabella and Mary. "Who are you, and what do you want?" "What I want is very simple, Carter. Stop looking for the cleaner. Go back to your life as a successful businessman and forget this whole story ever existed. It would be a shame if something happened to that cute little girl next to you." The call ended abruptly. Edward stood still for a few seconds, processing the direct threat against Isabella. He looked at the girl who was innocently playing with her doll, and felt a fury rise in his chest like he had never experienced before. "Mr. Edward, you look pale," Mary observed. "Is something wrong?" Edward put away his phone, trying to remain calm. "Aunt Mary, you and Isabella need to leave here. Today." "What do you mean?" the woman asked, alarmed. "I can't explain everything right now, but you are in danger. There are very bad people involved in Sarah's disappearance, and they know I'm helping you." Isabella stood up from the chair, her eyes wide with fear. "Uncle Edward, are the bad men going to hurt us like they did my mom?" "Mom?" Edward crouched down in front of her, holding her trembling little hands. "I won't let anyone hurt you, little one, but we need to be smart. I'm taking you to a safe place." Over the next hour, Edward organized an operation he never imagined he would have to lead. He called Marcus, asking him to book a discreet hotel in Santa Monica, far from New York City. He instructed Mary to pack a small bag with essentials for her and Isabella, leaving no traces of where they were going. "Uncle Edward," Isabella said as she stuffed her few clothes into a backpack, "when we leave here, how will my mom know where to find me when she comes back?" The innocent question pierced Edward's heart like a blade. How could he explain to a 6-year-old that her mom might never come back? How could he keep hope alive without feeding her a cruel illusion? "Your mom is very smart, Isa. She'll know where to look for you," he replied, promising himself he would do everything to make those words true. Before leaving East Harlem, Edward made a strategic stop. He sought out Mr. Johnson, a mechanic that Mary had mentioned as a close friend of Sarah. The man, African-American, around 50 years old, with calloused hands and a warm smile, welcomed them into his makeshift workshop in his backyard. "Edward Wright," Mr. Johnson said, wiping his oil-stained hands on a rag. "Mary told me about you. She said you're a good man helping to look for Sarah." "Mr. Johnson, I need to know everything you can about Sarah's last days, anything she mentioned, no matter how small." Mr. Johnson looked around, ensuring they were alone. "Sarah was scared, Edward. In the last few weeks, she came here almost every day, saying she had discovered some very serious things at her job." "What kind of things?" "She said that the wealth of pharmaceutical companies gathered to decide how many people would die from not being able to afford medication. She talked about papers she saw in the trash, conversations she overheard while cleaning the meeting rooms." Edward nodded, confirming what he already suspected. "Did she mention any specific names, companies?" Mr. Johnson hesitated, nervously glancing at Isabella, who was playing with a stray puppy in the yard. "She mentioned one name several times, Ricardo something. I think it was Ricardo Mendonça." Edward's stomach twisted. Ricardo Mendonça was not just a competitor. He was someone Edward had been doing business with for years. How many times had they discussed pricing strategies over fancy dinners in the Upper East Side? "There's one more thing," Mr. Johnson continued, lowering his voice. "The last time Sarah was here, she was really scared. She said she had made copies of important documents and hidden them in a safe place. She mentioned that if anything happened to her, someone should look at St. Anthony's Church over in the West Village." "St. Anthony's Church?" Edward repeated. "She knew the priest there, Father Michael. She said he was a trustworthy person who helped the poor without asking questions." Edward mentally noted the information. Another clue to follow, another thread to pull in that web of corruption and danger. "Mr. Johnson, you need to be very careful. If anyone comes here asking about Sarah or our conversation, you never saw me, understood?" The mechanic nodded gravely. "You can count on me, Edward. Here in the neighborhood, we know how to protect our own." When they finally left East Harlem, Edward drove his own car, a black BMW that starkly contrasted with the surroundings of the neighborhood. Mary sat in the passenger seat, visibly nervous about the luxury of the vehicle, while Isabella was in the back seat, enchanted by the leather seats and electronic controls. "Uncle Edward," Isabella said during the ride, "my mom always said that rich people's cars smell different. Now I know what the smell is. It smells new and expensive." Edward glanced at the girl in the rearview mirror and felt his heart tighten. In just a few days, that child had completely changed his perspective on the world. She showed him that there were battles more important than corporate achievements, that there were people willing to risk everything for justice. When they arrived at the hotel in Santa Monica, Edward settled Mary and Isabella into a comfortable room with an ocean view. The girl was ecstatic to see the ocean for the first time in her life, running to the window and pressing her face against the glass. "Look, Aunt Mary, the water goes on forever. It's just like the movies on TV." Mary smiled, but Edward noticed the worry in her eyes. She understood the gravity of the situation better than the child. "Edward," Mary said when Isabella went to explore the luxurious bathroom, "do you really believe you will be able to find Sarah?" Edward looked out the hotel window at the dark sea of the early night. "I will try with all my strength, Aunt Mary, but I need to be honest. The people involved in this story are very powerful, and I've been part of this corrupt world longer than I'd like to admit." "What will you do now?" Edward sighed deeply. "I'm going to the church Mr. Johnson mentioned. If Sarah really hid evidence there, it might be our only chance to uncover the truth and protect you too." That night, while Isabella slept hugging a rag doll in a hotel bed that cost more than the monthly rent of their home in East Harlem, Edward drove back to New York City with a heavy heart and a determined mind. He was about to discover that some truths are so dangerous that those who know them can never return to live in peace. St. Anthony's Church in the West Village was shrouded in darkness when Edward arrived at 10 o'clock at night. The neighborhood, known for its vibrant nightlife, strangely contrasted with the serenity of the small Catholic temple built. In the 1940s, the surrounding bars pulsed. With lively music and conversations, the church remained an oasis of silence amidst the urban chaos. Edward parked the BMW on a side street and walked to the main entrance. The solid wooden doors were closed, but a sign indicated that the parish house was at the back. With his heart racing, he walked around the building until he found a side door with a dim light on. "Good evening," said a gentle voice when Edward knocked on the door. "Can I help you?" Father Michael was a man in his 40s, with early grey hair and kind eyes behind simple glasses. He wore a navy polo shirt and jeans, far from the traditional robe Edward expected to find. "Father Michael, my name is Edward Carter. I need to talk to you about Sarah Carter." The priest's face tightened in immediate concern. He looked nervously around before inviting Edward inside. "Please, come in. I was hoping someone would come looking for her." The parish house was simple but welcoming. A modest room with well-kept antique sofas, a wooden table piled with papers and books, and walls decorated with religious images and photographs of community activities. "Father, I'm a friend of Isabella, Sarah's daughter. The girl came to me saying her mother has disappeared," Edward explained, sitting on the sofa the priest indicated. "Isabella," Father Michael whispered, closing his eyes for a moment. "How is the child? Where is she?" "She's safe, in a place where those people won't find her," Edward replied. "But I need to know what Sarah left here. A friend of hers told me she mentioned hiding something important in the church." Father Michael stood up and walked to a shelf, pulling out a thick volume that looked like an old prayer book. He opened the book and took out a flash drive and a sealed envelope. "Sarah came here last week, very scared," the priest began, handing the items to Edward. "She said she was investigating crimes against the poor and that her life was in danger. She asked me to keep this evidence and only give it to someone who mentioned Isabella's name." Edward took the flash drive with trembling hands. "Do you know what's on it?" "Sarah showed me some files. They are recordings, documents, photographs, evidence of a criminal scheme involving several pharmaceutical companies. Edward, these people are manipulating the prices of essential medications, causing the deaths of thousands of people who can't afford treatments." The weight of the revelation hit Edward like a punch to the stomach. He himself was part of this system, having attended meetings where they discussed pricing strategies without ever considering the human consequences. "Father, I need to see these files. But first, I need to know, did Sarah mention my name or my company?" The priest hesitated, studying Edward's face closely. She mentioned Carter Pharmaceuticals several times. She said the owner of the company seemed different from the others, that you might be an ally in the fight against corruption. Edward felt a mix of relief and responsibility. Sarah had identified something in him that he didn't even know he possessed, a possible redemption amidst the corruption of the system he had helped create. Edward, the priest continued, may I ask what your true intention is? Are you here to help or to protect the interests of your industry? It was a direct question that required an honest answer. Edward looked at his manicured hands, smooth and free of calluses, contrasting with the calloused hands of Mary and Mr. Johnson. Father Michael, I will be completely honest with you. Until I met Isabella, I was part of the problem. I attended meetings where we discussed prices without thinking about who would be harmed. But now I have seen the face of poverty. I have seen the suffering we have caused. I want to do the right thing, even if it destroys everything I have built. The priest studied Edward in silence for a few moments. Finally, he nodded slowly. Sarah said that if someone ever came to seek this evidence on behalf of Isabella, I should trust that person. She had a very keen instinct for judging people's character. Edward opened the sealed envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter from Sarah herself. If someone is reading this letter, it means something has happened to me. My name is Sarah Carter, I am Isabella's mother, and I have worked as a cleaner for 7 years. During this time, I discovered a criminal scheme that kills poor people every day. Pharmaceutical companies secretly meet to fix medication prices, keeping them artificially high to maximize profits. I documented everything, recordings, photographs, documents, the evidence that can prove this. Crime against humanity is on the flash drive. Please seek justice for my daughter and for all the children who die because their parents cannot afford medicines. Sarah Carter. Edward finished reading the letter with tears in his eyes. Sarah's neat handwriting trembled on some words, revealing the fear she felt while writing those lines. Father, can I use your computer to see what's on the flash drive? The priest led him to a small office at the back of the house. The computer was old, but it worked. Edward plugged in the flash drive and began to open the files. What he saw made him nauseous. Recordings of meetings where executives coldly discussed how many clients they could lose by raising prices by certain percentages. Documents detailing illegal market-sharing agreements. Photographs of secret contracts signed in expensive restaurants, and in the midst of it all, his own voice in a recording from 6 months ago. If we keep the price of insulin at this level, we secure a 300% margin. Diabetics have no choice anyway. Edward paused the recording, feeling physically ill. He had said those words without thinking, as a simple business strategy. Now he understood that every extra dollar in the price of insulin meant a diabetic person who could die because they couldn't afford the medication. Edward, said Father Michael. Father Michael gently asked, do you recognize your own voice? Yes, Edward replied, his voice choked with emotion. Father, I am a murderer. I may not have pulled the trigger, but I have killed people with my greed. What matters is not what you were, but what you choose to be from now on, Father Michael said, placing a comforting hand on Edward's shoulder. Sarah believed you could be the key to changing this system. Edward continued to explore the files. There was a folder titled Richard Morgan, Biotech Solutions, that contained even more shocking evidence. Recordings of Morgan offering bribes to FDA inspectors, contracts to eliminate competition through illegal practices, and even more disturbing, a conversation where he mentioned solving the cleaners' problem once and for all. My God, Edward murmured, they are talking about killing Sarah. Edward, Father Michael said urgently, do you realize that your life is now in danger too? If they find out you have this evidence... Before Edward could respond, the sound of tires screeching outside caught his attention. Through the office window, he saw two black SUVs stop in front of the church. Men in dark suits emerged from the vehicles, walking purposefully toward the entrance. "Father, is there a way out the back?" "Yes, through the sacristy. But Edward, take all of this with you. If something happens to me, this evidence cannot be lost." Edward quickly stored the flash drive and the letter, following Father Michael through dark corridors until they reached the church's sacristy. The priest opened a small door that led to a narrow alley. "Run," Father Michael whispered, "and remember what Sarah wrote. And seek justice for Isabella." Edward shook the priest's hand and ran down the alley, hearing behind him the sound of doors being kicked in and harsh voices asking questions. He reached the BMW, breathless, his heart racing. As he drove through the streets of the West Village, trying to process everything he had discovered, Edward realized he had crossed an irreversible line. He was no longer just a businessman trying to help a lost child. He was now the bearer of evidence that could destroy some of the most powerful men in America. And somewhere in New York City, Sarah Carter, if she was still alive, depended on him to ensure her courage and sacrifice were not in vain. The phone rang again. It was the same unknown number from hours earlier. "Carter, you made a very serious mistake tonight, but there is still time to remedy the situation." Edward took a deep breath before responding, feeling a determination he had never experienced before. "Go to hell, Richard. I know exactly who you are and what you did to Sarah Carter." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Then Morgan's voice came through, cold as ice. "So you chose the wrong side of the war, Edward. I hope you're prepared for the consequences." The call ended, but Edward continued driving through the early morning streets of New York City, carrying in his pocket the evidence that could change everything or condemn him to death. Edward drove all night through the empty streets of New York City, constantly changing routes to make sure he wasn't being followed. His mind was racing with the revelations from the flash drive, and every red light made him nervously glance at the rearview mirrors. At 5 in the morning, he decided to stop at a small 24-hour cafe in the Olympic Village to organize his thoughts and devise a plan. The establishment was nearly empty, just a few night shift workers and one or two insomniacs sipping strong coffee to face another day. Edward chose a table in the back, with his back to the wall and a clear view of the entrance. He ordered a black coffee and opened his laptop, connecting to the internet through his phone. He needed to find out more about Sarah Carter's whereabouts, but he also needed to start understanding the true extent of the corruption network she had uncovered. If he was going to expose everything, he needed to be strategic. One wrong move, and the evidence could disappear along with him. He began researching news about deaths related to the lack of medications in recent months. The numbers were staggering. Hundreds of Americans had died because they couldn't afford insulin, high blood pressure medications, essential antibiotics. Each statistic represented a shattered family, a life lost to the greed he himself had helped perpetuate. "May I sit here?" Edward looked up to find a woman in her mid-30s, with black hair tied back in a ponytail, wearing jeans and a discreet blouse. She carried a briefcase and had the determined look of someone who doesn't easily take no for an answer. "Sorry, Mum, but I prefer to be alone," Edward replied, instinctively closing his laptop. Edward Carter, CEO of Carter Pharmaceuticals, 52 years old, widower, no children, estimated fortune of $800 million, the woman said, sitting down uninvited. "Last night you were at St. Anthony's Church, looking for evidence left by Sarah Carter, and now you're here at 5 in the morning trying to figure out how to expose the biggest corruption scheme in the American pharmaceutical industry." Edward felt his blood run cold. "Who are you?" "Someone who was working with Sarah Carter before she disappeared," the woman replied, extending her hand. Jessica Taylor, investigative journalist from the New York Times. Or rather, former journalist. I was fired last week after my editors received external pressures to cancel the article about the pharmaceutical cartel. Edward studied the woman's face, searching for signs that it could be a trap. But there was something in her eyes, the same determination he had seen in Sarah's gaze through the photographs. "How do I know I can trust you?" Edward asked. Jessica opened her briefcase and pulled out a photograph of Sarah with Isabella at a playground. "Sarah gave me this photo as proof that we had met. She said if anything happened to her, I should look for the man who was taking care of her daughter." The photo showed Sarah pushing Isabella on a swing, in a balance, both smiling genuinely. On the back it was written, "For Jessica, if you are reading this, take care of my Isabella, Sarah Carter, May 15th, 2024. "How did Sarah get to know you?" Edward asked, beginning to lower his guard. "She reached out to me 3 months ago after reading a series of articles I published about exorbitant drug prices. She brought preliminary evidence and asked for help to investigate further. For weeks, we worked together collecting proof, recording conversations, photographing documents." Jessica paused, taking a sip of the coffee she had ordered. "Edward, Sarah always spoke about you. She said you were different from other CEOs, that perhaps you could be convinced to do the right thing if you knew the truth about what was happening." "So, she knew who I was from the beginning?" "Of course she did. Sarah had cleaned your office several times. She told me you had pictures of children on your desk, employees' kids, nieces. She said you always treated the cleaners with respect, unlike other executives who completely ignored them." Edward vaguely remembered the times he had greeted the cleaning staff, not realizing that one of them was conducting an investigation into his own company. "Jessica, where is Sarah now?" The journalist's face darkened. "I don't know. Our last meeting was 5 days ago, at a cafe in Little Italy. She was nervous, said she had discovered something very serious about Richard Morgan, and that she was going to get definitive evidence that night. It was the night she disappeared." "And you didn't go looking for her when she didn't check in?" "I went to East Harlem the next day, but the neighbor said a child had left with a man in a suit. I thought they might have kidnapped Isabella too," Jessica explained. "Only later did I find out that the man was you." Edward opened his laptop again and showed some of the files from the flash drive to Jessica. The journalist examined the evidence with experienced eyes, taking notes in a small notebook. "Edward, this is pure dynamite," she said, after analyzing several recordings. "With this evidence, we can take down not just Richard Morgan, but the entire network of executives involved. But first, we need to find Sarah." "I have a theory about where she might be," Edward said. "In the recordings, Morgan mentions a secure facility where they solve sensitive problems. Do you have any idea what that could be?" Jessica thought for a few moments. "Sarah mentioned that Morgan had a private security company. As a front, it's called Total Security, registered in his wife's name, but it serves for illegal operations." Edward quickly searched on Google. Total Security had an address in an industrial area of Guarulhos, far from downtown New York City. According to the website, they offered property security and valuables transport services. "That's it," Edward said confidently. "That's where they are keeping Sarah." "Edward, do you realize this could be a trap? If we go there and we're wrong, Jessica, a 6-year-old girl, is waiting for her mom in a hotel in Santa Monica. Sarah risked her life to expose these criminals. I can't just hand the evidence over to the police and hope she shows up." The journalist studied Edward's determined face. "You've changed a lot since you met Isabella, haven't you?" "I've completely changed," Edward admitted. "For the first time in my life, I understand that there are things more important than money and power, and one of them is making sure a little girl gets her mum back." Jessica closed her notebook and put away the folder. Then let's go get Sarah Carter, but first let's make copies of all the evidence and put them in safe hands. If something happens to us, at least the truth won't die with us. For the next hour, Edward and Jessica worked together, copying all the files to various flash drives. They emailed copies to human rights lawyers, journalists from other outlets, and even to federal representatives known for fighting corruption. "Done," Jessica said, putting away the last flash drive. "Now, even if they silence us, the evidence will still exist." At 7 in the morning, they set off for Guarulhos in Edward's BMW. The New York City traffic was starting to get heavy, but they had a purpose that transcended any inconvenience. "Edward," Jessica said during the drive, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "Why have you never remarried? How long has it been since you lost your wife?" Edward sighed, keeping his eyes on the road. 8 years. Pancreatic cancer. She always said I worked too much, that I was losing my life because of business. I promised I would change after she recovered, but—" his voice faltered. "And you never changed, until you met Isabella." "Exactly. Marina was right. I was living only to accumulate money and power, without thinking about the real impact of my decisions. Isabella showed me that every business choice affects real people, real families." When they arrived at the address of Total Security, they found an apparently abandoned industrial complex. Huge warehouses with broken windows, rusty doors, and overgrown land. But Edward noticed details indicating recent activity: tire marks on the asphalt, cigarette butts on the ground, a modern security camera hidden among the vegetation. "There's someone here," Edward murmured, parking the car away from the main entrance. "Edward," Jessica said, touching his arm, "before we go in there, I want you to know something. Sarah always said you had a second chance to make a difference in the world. If we can save her today, you will have fulfilled that prophecy." Edward looked at the industrial complex in front of him, where a brave woman might be held captive for trying to protect the most vulnerable. "Then let's fulfill that prophecy," he said, checking that the flash drive with the evidence was still secure in his pocket. The morning sun of New York City began to warm the asphalt as they walked toward what could be the final confrontation with years of corruption and greed. And, somewhere in that maze of abandoned warehouses, Sarah Carter, if she was still alive. Edward Carter was about to discover that his faith in human redemption had not been in vain. Edward and Jessica approached the industrial complex with extreme caution, keeping low among the tall vegetation that grew around the warehouses. The morning sun cast long shadows between the abandoned buildings, providing natural cover for their movements. The silence of the place was unsettling. Only the distant roar of highway traffic and the occasional chirping of birds broke the sinister quiet. "There," Jessica whispered, pointing to a smaller warehouse at the back of the complex. "There's movement in that window." Edward followed her gaze and saw a shadow quickly passing through the partially covered opening with wooden planks. 2 white pickup trucks were parked next to the building, confirming that the location was not as abandoned as it seemed. "Let's approach from the back," Edward murmured, indicating a path that would take them behind the warehouse, out of sight of anyone who might be guarding the main entrance. As they carefully moved through the weeds and industrial debris, Edward couldn't stop thinking about Isabella. The image of the girl looking out the hotel window in Santa Monica, waiting for news of her mom, gave him a determination he had never experienced in his corporate battles. They reached the back wall of the warehouse undetected. Edward pressed his ear against the corrugated metal wall and could distinguish male voices speaking in low tones. One of them he recognized immediately. It was Richard Morgan. "Can't stay here much longer. The press is going to start asking questions, and Carter is poking around where he shouldn't." "Boss, what do we do with her?" asked a second, rougher voice. "First, she signs a statement saying she made it all up. Then Well, you know what to do. Edward felt his blood boil. Jessica grabbed his arm, sensing the tension in his muscles. They had to act quickly, but smartly. "Jessica," Edward whispered, "have you called the police?" "I called when we were on our way, but it will take at least 20 minutes for them to get here. Sarah might not have that long." Edward looked around, searching for a way to get into the warehouse. A side window was partially open, located about 3 meters off the ground. There was a pile of abandoned construction materials that could serve as an improvised ladder. "I'm going to try to get in through there," Edward said, pointing to the window. "You stay here, and if anything goes wrong, run and wait for the police." "No way," Jessica retorted firmly. "We're in this together." They moved to the pile of debris, and Edward began to climb carefully, testing each support before putting his weight on it. The Italian suit he was wearing was not exactly suitable for climbing, but the urgency of the situation outweighed any discomfort. Reaching the window, Edward managed to see inside the warehouse. It was a spacious area, divided into smaller sections by makeshift partitions. In one of the sections, he saw Sarah Carter. She was sitting in a plastic chair, her hands tied behind her back. Her face showed signs of fatigue and fear, but she maintained an upright posture, demonstrating a dignity that even the situation couldn't break. 2 men were guarding her, while Richard Morgan paced back and forth, talking on the phone. "I need you to understand. Carter is becoming a problem. He has the evidence and is willing to use it. We're going to have to speed up the whole process." Edward needed to create a distraction to draw the guards away from Sarah. He looked around and found some medium-sized stones. Carefully, he threw one in the opposite direction of the warehouse, making a loud metallic noise when it hit a metal sheet. "What was that?" one of the guards asked. "Go check it out," Morgan ordered. "And you, keep an eye on her." One of the men left in the direction of the noise, halving the watch on Sarah. Edward waited until the man was completely away before starting to enter through the window. The carelessness of the operation was that his keys fell from his pocket, making a metallic noise on the warehouse floor. The guard who had stayed turned immediately. "Hey! Is someone here?" Edward had no choice. He jumped from the window, landing heavily on the concrete floor. The pain in his ankle was intense, but the adrenaline kept him on his feet. The guard was coming toward him when Edward shouted, "Sarah, Isabella is waiting for you. She's safe." The effect of the words was immediate. Sarah lifted her head with renewed energy, and for a moment, her eyes met Edward's. There was recognition in that look. She knew exactly who he was. "Edward Carter," Richard Morgan said, emerging from the shadows with a cold smile. "What a surprise to find you here. Although, thinking about it, it's not that surprising. Richard, let that woman go. You know she was just doing what was right." "What was right?" Morgan laughed sarcastically. "Edward, you've always been naive. This woman was trying to destroy an entire industry, end jobs, cause chaos in the pharmaceutical sector. We are the heroes of this story, not her." "Heroes?" Edward felt the anger rise in his voice. "You kill people every day with your exorbitant prices. How many children have died because their parents couldn't afford insulin? How many elderly people stopped taking their blood pressure medication because it cost more than their pension?" During this discussion, Edward didn't realize that Jessica had managed to enter the warehouse through another entrance. She was moving silently through the shadows, approaching Sarah. "Edward," Morgan said, pulling a gun from his waistband, "you had your chance to stay out of this. You could have continued your life of luxury and let the adults handle business. But no, you had to come play hero because of a kid from the neighborhood." "That kid from the neighborhood has a name," Edward said, stepping forward despite the gun pointed at him. "Her name is Isabella Santos. She's 6 years old, likes rag dolls, and believes That your mom is the smartest person in the world, and she is right. While Edward kept Morgan distracted with conversation, Jessica managed to cut the ropes binding Sarah. The journalist had brought a small pocket knife she always carried for emergencies. "Sarah," Jessica whispered softly, "I'm friends with Edward. Isabella is safe. When I give the signal, you run to the back exit." Sarah nodded almost imperceptibly, preparing to run as soon as she had the chance. "Edward," Morgan continued, "do you really think you're going to walk out of here alive? That you'll be able to tell your romantic version of the story? Richard, even if you kill me here, the evidence is already in dozens of different places. The truth will come out anyway." "What evidence? You mean this?" Morgan pulled out the original flash drive that Sarah had left at the church. "My men were more efficient than you thought. Father Michael was very cooperative after we paid him a visit." Edward felt his stomach drop. "What did you do to Father?" "Nothing he didn't deserve for interfering in matters that weren't his business." At that moment, Jessica made the agreed signal. Sarah quickly stood up and began to run toward the back of the warehouse. The movement caught the guards by surprise, and in the moment of distraction that followed, Edward lunged at Morgan. The two men rolled on the floor, struggling for possession of the weapon. Edward had trained at the gym for years, but had never been in a real fight. Morgan, on the other hand, seemed to have experience in physical confrontations. "Jessica, get Sarah out of here!" Edward shouted as he fought. One of the guards who had returned tried to intervene, but Jessica surprised him with pepper spray she had in her bag. The man screamed in pain, temporarily incapacitated. During the struggle, the weapon fired into the ceiling of the warehouse. The noise echoed through the industrial complex like thunder. Edward managed to get on top, but Morgan was stronger and soon reversed the position. That was when the sound of sirens began to approach. The police had arrived sooner than expected. "It's over, Richard," Edward said, breathless. "You've lost." Morgan looked around, realizing that his operation had collapsed. The guards began to flee, abandoning him. In a matter of seconds, he was alone in the warehouse with Edward. "This isn't over, Carter," he said, getting up and holstering the weapon. "You have no idea how many powerful people are involved in this. You've messed with the wrong people." "Maybe," Edward replied, also getting up and wiping the blood that was dripping from a cut on his face. "But at least one girl is going to have her mom back, and that's worth any consequence." When the police stormed the warehouse, they found Edward alone. Morgan had escaped through an exit he knew at the back of the complex. But outside, Sarah Carter was in Jessica's arms, free after days of captivity. "Edward," Sarah said, approaching him with tears in her eyes, "thank you for taking care of my Isabella. I knew you were different from the others." "Sarah, how can you thank me? I'm part of the system that put her in this situation." "No," she shook her head, firmly. "You chose to do the right thing when you had the chance. That's what matters." As they gave statements to the police, Edward looked at Sarah and Jessica and realized he had found something he didn't know he was looking for. People willing to fight for what is right, even when the price of that fight is high. The sun was already high when they finished speaking with the investigators. Edward had only one thought in his mind: to take Sarah Carter back to her daughter Isabella. The trip to Santa Monica would be long, but it would also be the beginning of a new phase in the lives of everyone involved. A phase where money would no longer be the only measure of success. The journey from JFK Airport to Santa Monica was an intense, emotional ride. Sarah sat in the front seat next to Edward, while Jessica settled in the back, discreetly documenting every moment of this historic reunion. The initial silence of the car was broken only by the soft sound of the radio and Sarah's stifled sobs as she processed her freedom. "Tell me about Isabella," Sarah asked, wiping her tears with a tissue. Edward had offered. "How did she react when I disappeared? Did she understand what was happening?" Edward adjusted the rearview mirror to see Sarah's anxious face. "She's stronger than you think, Sarah. When she looked for me, she was scared but determined to find you. She spoke of you with such pride, saying that her mum was the smartest person she knew." "She really said that?" Sarah asked, a faint smile appearing for the first time in days. "She did. And she also told me how you used to read newspapers to her, how you explained the news, how you always said that knowledge is power," Edward continued. "Jessica, you should have seen the dignity of that girl. 6 years old and braver than most adults I know." Jessica observed the conversation from the back seat, making mental notes for the article she would write about the entire experience. "Sarah, can I ask, when you started the investigation, did you know the risks you were taking?" Sarah looked out the window at the passing landscape, neighborhoods giving way to middle-class areas, then to the more luxurious buildings of the southern part of the city. "I knew it was dangerous, but I didn't imagine it would come to this point. I started just collecting papers from the trash, listening to conversations. It was more curiosity than formal investigation." "And when did you realize you had discovered something important?" Edward pressed. "It was one night when I was cleaning the conference room at Biotech Innovations. Richard Morgan and other executives were discussing how to raise the price of insulin by 200% before Christmas, because diabetics will pay any price to not die during the holidays." Sarah paused, the indignation still evident in her voice. "At that moment I understood that they were just business people making deals. They were predators, taking advantage of the desperation of the sick." Edward felt a lump in his throat. "Sarah, I need to confess something. In the recordings you made, there's a meeting where my voice is heard saying terrible things about drug prices. I said those words, and now I realize how many people may have died because of my decisions." Sarah studied Edward's profile as he drove. "Edward, do you know what difference I noticed between you and the other executives?" "What?" "You always greeted the cleaners. You always said, 'Good morning, thank you for your work.' To the others, we were invisible, and during the few times I cleaned your office, I saw pictures of children on your desk. I realized you still had humanity somewhere inside you." "You were right," Edward admitted, "although it was your daughter who showed me that." As they approached Santa Monica, Edward's phone rang. It was Mary. "Mr. Carter, how are things? Isabella is anxious, asking all the time when she will hear news about her mom." "Aunt Mary, get ready for a very nice surprise. We're arriving with Sarah." On the other end of the line, there was silence followed by shouts of joy. Edward heard Isabella's voice in the background. "Aunt Mary, is that my mom? Is my mom back?" "Do you want to talk to her?" Edward offered, handing the phone to Sarah. "Isabella, my daughter," Sarah said, her voice choked with emotion. "Mommy!" Isabella shouted from the other side. "Mommy, where have you been? I was so scared, but Uncle Edward took care of me. He is so nice." "I'm coming home, my love. Mommy was taking care of some important issues, but it's over now. I'm coming back to you." "Mommy, Uncle Edward brought me to see the ocean. It's huge. It has no end. And there's a room just for me with a huge bed and a bathroom that looks like a movie." Edward smiled, listening to Isabella's excitement. In the past few days he had grown accustomed to the girl's presence and realized he would miss her constant company. When they arrived at the hotel in Santa Monica, Isabella was waiting at the reception with Mary, wearing a new dress that Edward had sent Marcus to buy. The moment she saw her mother entering the lobby, the girl took off running as if there were no end. "Mommy!" Sarah knelt on the floor of the luxurious lobby, opening her arms to welcome her daughter. The impact of the hug nearly knocked her over, but she held Isabella tightly, as if she would never let her go. My daughter, my princess, Sarah cried, covering Isabella's face with kisses. Mommy missed you so much, so much. I knew Uncle Edward would find you, Isabella said through tears and smiles. I told Aunt Mary he was very important and that he would succeed. Edward watched the scene from a few meters away, feeling a mix of joy and melancholy. Mary approached him, wiping her own eyes with her apron. Mr. Carter, I have no words to thank you for what you've done for this family. Aunt Mary, they changed my life more than I changed theirs. Jessica discreetly documented the reunion, knowing that those images would be an essential part of the article she would write about corruption in the pharmaceutical industry. But more than that, she was witnessing a moment of pure humanity amid a story of greed and corruption. Uncle Edward, Isabella called, running to him without completely letting go of her mother's hand. Now that my mom is back, are you leaving? The question hit Edward like a dagger. During those days taking care of Isabella, he had experienced a fatherhood he never had. The girl had filled a void in his life he didn't even know existed. Isabella, I need to go back to New York City to take care of some important matters related to your mum's work. But will you come back to visit us? The girl insisted with those big, hopeful eyes. Edward looked at Sarah, who was watching the interaction with a knowing smile. Of course I will, little one. You all are part of my family now. Edward, Sarah said, stepping closer, I need to ask something. What will happen now? With the evidence, with Richard Morgan, with this whole situation? Jessica will publish the full article with all the evidence. The police are already investigating, and I'm sure other companies involved in the scheme will be exposed, Edward explained. But Sarah, do you realize that your life may still be in danger? These people won't give up easily. Sarah held Isabella's hand tighter. What do you suggest? Come live with me in New York City. I have a big house with security where you would be protected. Isabella could attend a private school. You could work in a different position. What kind of position? Sarah asked, curious. Director of Social Responsibility at Carter Pharmaceuticals, someone who would ensure we never make decisions that harm the poor again. Sarah was silent for a few moments, processing the offer. Mary held her hand, indicating support for whatever decision she made. Edward, Sarah finally said, I accept to work with you, but not as a favor or charity, as a qualified professional who will help transform your company into a force for good in the world. Uncle Edward, Isabella interrupted, if Mommy is going to work with you, does that mean we will be a real family? Edward knelt to the girl's height, holding her little hands. Isabella, we are already a family, a chosen family, formed not by blood, but by love and mutual respect. That night at the hotel restaurant overlooking the ocean, they dined together for the first time as a complete family. Isabella told her mother about everything that had happened, the luxury car Uncle Edward drove, the luxurious room, the different food she had tried. Mummy, Uncle Edward even learned to eat caramel popcorn like we like, Isabella said, laughing. Is that true? Sarah asked, amused. It's true, Edward confirmed. I discovered that there are many simple things in life that are. As he watched Isabella playing in the sand on the beach after dinner, Edward realized that his journey of redemption was just beginning. He had found not only a new family, but a new purpose for his life. And for the first time in decades, Edward Carter slept with a truly clear conscience, knowing that the next day he would wake up as a different man, ready to use his wealth and power to build a better world. The ocean breeze of Santa Monica carried with it the promise of a new chapter, where justice and love would triumph over greed and corruption. 3 months had passed since the rescue of Sarah Carter, and New York City was witnessing one of the largest overhauls in the pharmaceutical industry. Jessica Taylor's article had become the investigative report of the year, winning national and international awards, while sparking a wave of investigations that spread like seismic waves throughout the sector. Edward was in his office at Carter Pharmaceuticals, but the environment had changed drastically. The walls, once adorned only with business awards, now displayed colorful drawings from Isabella, photographs of the new family he had formed, and charts showing the progressive reduction of essential medicine prices that his company had implemented. "Mr. Carter," said Marcus, entering with a stack of documents, "the shareholders of Pharmex Industries want an urgent meeting. It seems they are willing to adopt our ethical pricing model." Edward smiled, signing an authorization for the donation of a batch of insulin to health clinics in underserved areas. "Marcus, schedule it for Thursday and call Sarah to join the meeting. She knows more about the social impact of our products than any expensive consultant we've ever hired." Sarah had adapted surprisingly well to her new role. Her desk was on the executive floor, next to Edward's office, and she had become the moral compass of the company. All projects now underwent her social impact analysis before being approved. "Edward," said Sarah, appearing at the door with Isabella by her side, "can I interrupt for a minute?" "Of course, come in." Isabella ran to Edward, who had officially become her godfather after a legal adoption process that ensured mutual legal rights. The girl was now studying at a private school near the office, but insisted on spending every afternoon at the company, where she had become the unofficial mascot of the employees. "Uncle Edward, can I use your computer to do my homework?" Isabella asked, already heading to the executive desk as if it were her own. "Sure, Princess, but don't mess with my secret files," Edward joked, watching her type with the ease of a digital native. "What secret files?" Isabella asked curiously. "The plans for your birthday party next week," Edward revealed, prompting a squeal of delight from the girl. Sarah sat in the armchair in front of Edward's desk. In recent months, she had become not only his work partner, but one of the most important people in his life. Their daily meetings were a mix of business discussions and personal conversations that Edward had never imagined having. "Edward, we received the results of the research we commissioned on the impact of price reductions," Sarah said, opening a folder. "In 3 months, we saved approximately 1,200 lives that would have been lost due to lack of access to medications." Edward stopped signing documents and looked directly at Sarah. 1,200 people? 1,200 people who can now afford insulin, blood pressure medications, and the antibiotics they need. Families who no longer have to choose between buying food or medicine. Edward leaned back in his chair, processing the real impact of his decisions. "You know, Sarah, for decades I thought success was measured only in profit figures. Now I realize that those 200 lives are worth more than all the millions I've accumulated. And the best part," Sarah continued, "is that even with the reduced prices, the company remains profitable. Proof that it's possible to do good while doing well." Isabella lifted her head from the computer. "Uncle Edward, what does doing good while doing well mean?" "It means we can make money, honestly, by helping people instead of taking advantage of their suffering," Edward explained, leaning closer to the girl. "Like Robin Hood!" Isabella exclaimed excitedly. "He took from the rich to give to the poor." "Sort of," Edward laughed. "But we don't take from anyone. We just stop charging unfair prices." The intercom on the desk buzzed. It was the receptionist announcing an unexpected visitor. "Mr. Carter, there's an Aunt Mary downstairs wanting to speak with you." Edward exchanged surprised glances with Sarah. "Please, send her up." Aunt Mary appeared a few minutes later, visibly nervous in the luxurious environment of the executive office. She was wearing her best clothes, a floral blouse and a navy blue skirt, and carrying a fabric bag. "Aunt Mary!" Isabella shouted, running to hug the woman who had cared for her during her mother's disappearance. "Hi, my dear," Aunt Mary said, kissing Isabella's head. "I came to bring you some things." "Aunt Mary, what a nice surprise," Edward said, standing up to greet her. "Please, have a seat. Would you like some coffee, water?" "A little coffee would be nice," Aunt Mary replied, still looking impressed by the office. "My goodness, Sarah, what a beautiful place you work in now." Sarah smiled, serving coffee in a porcelain cup that contrasted with the simple mugs they shared in East Harlem. "How are things over there, dear?" "That's why I came here," Aunt Mary said, opening the bag. "I brought some things you forgot, but I also came to share some news." She pulled out Isabella's cloth doll, the same one the girl had held on the night of her mother's disappearance. "My doll," Isabella exclaimed, taking the toy with affection. "I missed you so much." "And there's more," Aunt Mary continued, pulling out a yellowed envelope. A letter addressed to Mr. Edward, friend of Isabella, arrived. It came without a return address, but I thought I should deliver it. Edward took the envelope with curiosity. Inside was a sheet of... As he tried to match her height, he asked, "Did you think all rich people were evil?" "My mom always said yes, but Isabella said you're different." Isabella appeared beside her friend, proud. "It's true. My Uncle Edward went from being an evil rich guy to a good rich guy." The party was set up on the small soccer field in the community, transformed into a complete fair. Stalls sold corn pudding, roasted corn, spiced hot cider, and traditional sweets. A bonfire crackled in the center of the space, surrounded by plastic chairs where the older folks settled in to chat. A car stereo played country music and folk tunes, while some people were already practicing their first dance steps. "Edward!" shouted Mr. Johnson, the mechanic who had provided clues about Carla's whereabouts. "Come here, man. I want to introduce you to everyone." For the next hour, Edward was introduced to practically all the residents of the community. He met the retired teacher who had taught half the children in the neighborhood, the baker who woke up at 3 a.m. to provide fresh bread for everyone, and the seamstress who repaired donated clothes so that the children always had something decent to wear. "You know, Mr. Edward," said Mrs. Johnson, the retired teacher, "when Mary told us that a wealthy businessman had helped Carla, we were a bit suspicious. Here, in the outskirts, we learn that rich people only show up when they want something. And you were right to be suspicious," Edward admitted. "I was that kind of rich guy until a few months ago. But what changed?" Edward looked around and saw Isabella playing with the other children, Carla chatting animatedly with the neighbors, and felt the warmth of the community that had welcomed him without asking for anything in return. "I learned that there are things more valuable than money," Edward replied simply. As night fell, the party took on an even more special atmosphere. The makeshift lights created a cozy ambience, and the smell of spiced hot cider mixed with the smoke from the bonfire. Edward was sitting on a wooden bench, drinking spiced cider from an aluminum mug, when Jessica Taylor appeared among the crowd. "Jessica, what a surprise!" Edward exclaimed, getting up to greet her. "I couldn't miss this party," said the journalist, hugging Edward and then Carla. "I came to bring fresh news about our corrupt friends." "What kind of news?" Carla asked, intrigued. "Richard Morgan was arrested yesterday at JFK Airport trying to board a flight to Uruguay. It seems he decided to flee when he learned that more businessmen involved in the scheme were turning state's evidence." Edward felt a huge relief. "And the others involved?" 7 businessmen have already been indicted, including 2 directors from the FDA who were taking bribes. The investigation is spreading throughout the national pharmaceutical sector, Jessica explained. Your decision to expose everything created a domino effect that no one expected. Uncle Edward, interrupted Isabella, running over with her face smeared with corn pudding. Do you want to dance with me? I don't know how to dance, little one. I'll teach you. It's easy. Edward found himself dragged into the circle where people were organizing for the traditional folk dance. Isabella positioned him beside her, while Carla stood opposite with Mr. Johnson as her partner. "Look, everyone," shouted the party host with a wireless microphone. "We have Mr. Edward, the man who helped our Carla. Let's do a special dance for him." The music started, and Edward found himself trying to keep up with the traditional dance steps, stumbling over his own legs while Isabella laughed and patiently corrected him. "Sway!" shouted the host, and Edward swayed from side to side, back and forth, and he tried to follow Isabella's movements. Left arm, and Edward, completely confused, went the wrong way, causing widespread laughter. "Uncle Edward, you're dancing like a broken robot." Isabella laughed. "It's just that I've never learned these dances, Princess." "Everyone here will teach you. Mrs. Johnson, come help Uncle Edward." Soon, Edward found himself surrounded by a dozen people, all eager to teach him the basic steps of the dance. The atmosphere was completely relaxed. No one cared that he was a millionaire businessman running one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the country. To everyone there, he was simply Edward, the man who had brought Carla back to Isabella. During the dance, Edward realized he had found something that all the money in the world couldn't buy: a genuine community, people who cared for each other not out of interest, but out of pure humanity. "Edward," Carla said during a pause in the music, "look around you. Do you see how happy everyone is just because you're here?" Edward observed the smiling faces, the children running among the adults, the elderly telling stories around the bonfire, and the young couples discreetly flirting in the darker corners. "I see, and I understand why. You fought so hard to protect these people." "I didn't fight just for them," Carla said, moving closer to Edward. "I fought for you too, because I knew there was a good man hidden beneath that expensive suit." Isabella appeared between them, holding both their hands. "Now let's form a giant circle, everyone together." The party extended into the early hours of the morning. Edward danced until his feet hurt, ate corn pudding until he couldn't anymore, and listened to life stories that moved him to tears. When it was finally time to leave, dozens of people bid him farewell, with sincere hugs and invitations to come back any time. "Mr. Edward," Mary said at the farewell, "you will always have a home here in the community, and a family that wishes for your happiness. Thank you, Mrs. Mary, for everything." During the ride back to the Upper East Side, Isabella fell asleep in the back seat, hugging her rag doll and wearing a satisfied smile. Carla watched her daughter through the rearview mirror while Edward drove in silence. "Edward," Carla said softly, "can I confess something?" "Of course." "When you showed up that day on the building stairs, it wasn't a coincidence. I had asked Isabella to specifically look for you. For you." Edward almost lost control of the steering wheel. "What do you mean?" "I had cleaned your office several times and knew you were different from the others. When I realized that my investigation was putting me in danger, I instructed Isabella that if anything happened to me, she should look for the man in the suit who always greeted the cleaners." Edward pulled the car over to the side of the road, needing to process that revelation. "Did you plan all of this?" "I planned that if something happened to me, Isabella would find someone decent to protect her. I didn't plan for that someone to completely change their life because of her." Edward looked at Sarah in the dark of the car, illuminated only by the lights of the road. "Sarah, you saved my life as much as I saved yours." "No," she shook her head. "We saved each other. And we saved Isabella from growing up in a world where corruption and greed triumph over humanity and justice." Edward resumed driving, but now with a feeling of completeness he had never experienced before. In the past few months, He had lost millions in profits by reducing the prices of medicines. He had faced death threats from former business partners. He had completely transformed his company and his personal life, and he had never felt so rich. When they arrived home, the mansion on the Upper East Side that now housed 3 people who had become a true family, Edward carried the sleeping Isabella to her room, covering her with her favorite blanket. The little girl murmured, "Thank you, Uncle Edward," without opening her eyes. In the living room, Sarah prepared chamomile tea while Edward lit the fireplace. They sat together on the sofa, watching the flames dance hypnotically. "Edward," Sarah said, resting her head on his shoulder, "what are we going to do now?" "Now we will continue changing the world, one child at a time, one medicine at a time, one ethical decision at a time." And Isabella will grow up knowing she can trust adults, that there is justice in the world, and that sometimes people can change for the better. From upstairs, the soft sound of Isabella's breathing reached them, a perfect soundtrack for the end of a journey that had begun with a lost child asking for help on a cold staircase and ended with a family united by love and the desire to build a better world. Edward looked at the flames in the fireplace and knew he had found his true purpose in life. It wasn't about accumulating wealth or gaining power. It was about protecting people like Isabella, empowering women like Sarah, and using his privileged position to ensure that other children wouldn't have to choose between eating and getting their medicines. The lost little girl who had changed his life was sleeping peacefully upstairs. And Edward Carter finally understood the true meaning of success, having the people you love sleeping safely under your roof, knowing that tomorrow you will wake up to continue making the world a better place for them.